Good evening, good morning, hello, bonjour, ni hao. Today we'd like to talk about God and DNA. Some of my most important work has been on the understanding of God, because at some point in a seeker's life, the spiritual seeker, they want to understand God. Many of you or people you know, they want to understand God. They want to know who is the maker. How did we get here? Why? Why do we suffer? So I started my research and I wanted to find out who God was. And I went to the standard source, which was the biblical material. But there was a problem with the biblical material because biblical material has been edited. And the editors have an agenda, right? So the editors, the people who edited the biblical material, they edited it to suit their own misogyny, right? All men, all written to favor the narrative that they needed to control and influence the people. Okay, so, but I found some evidence in that material, but it wasn't conclusive. It was not clear. I needed to go somewhere where the material had not been edited, where I can get raw. You know, because when you want raw data, you want the raw video. When you see something, you want to see the raw material. That will tell you if it's real, if it's true, because things can be edited, right? When you see news is heavily edited, so you want to see the raw video, what really happened, what was the full discussion, what's really going on. The best place I found to get that raw information about God, about the Maker, was in the Gnostic texts. Now you may know this as the Nag Hammadi text, Nag Hammadi Bible, which was a number of texts that were lost and were discovered in the mid-1940s, I think 1947, in Egypt. And they unearthed these texts, and they spent decades translating these texts. One of the texts they discovered was the Gospel of Mary, right? Mary, the whore, the prostitute. They discovered this, and the church never accepted it. A more recent text that was unearthed that's connected to that Gnostic library is the Gospel of Judas, which provides a whole new perspective on Judas. I began to look very closely. I spent many hours studying the Gnostic texts and the different translations. And I began to see a pattern. It started to remind me of something, the way they talked about things. First there was a monad, then there was a dyad, then there was a quadrad. So the tetrad, sorry, not the quadrad. You have all of these things talking about God, but they didn't talk about God in the same manner as the Christians. Now, the Gnostics and the Christians started about the same time. They were against each other. And what happened was Christianity eventually was able to label the Gnostics as heretics. And that eventually put them out of business. But they were smart enough to bury their texts. 2,000 years later, they would find them. Now, why are the Gnostic texts relevant to understanding God? Because A, they have raw information. So what I mean raw information is, at the time, somebody witnesses something and they write it down. And it sounds pretty weird. It has a kind of a rhythmic language, it has a poetic language. Some of the discussions are very hard to follow because they just use the raw data. And then there was a light and the portal was opened. They have the cloud. There was a cloud, and emerging from the cloud came this illuminated being. And he called himself, so it was just like, it's almost like a testimony of somebody witnessing these spiritual or supernatural events. But within all of those discussions, I found a code. In other words, what they talked about is not what we interpret, it's not about God. It's a coded language. It's a coded language that you have to decode to understand what they're talking about. And unfortunately, it took 2,000 years to reach the level to be able to decode it. This is very interesting, because when the Gnostics were talking about God, they often talked about the one who is, right? The one who is. And they talked about Upper and Lower Egypt. And they talked about the one who is the Father of the all. The Father of the all. And he has one begotten Son. And when you break down the code, when you start to understand the language, I found a similarity between the way the Gnostics spoke about God and microbiology, which is very interesting. I'm not a microbiologist, I'm not a scientist per se. So I had to brush up on my microbiology, molecular biology, basically DNA, genetics. And when I started to read genetics and molecular biology, they were saying the same thing that the Gnostics were saying. The way the Gnostics talked about God, how he replicated, how he was the Father of the all, and how they contained everything about him within themselves, right? How each cell contains the same DNA as each other cell. It talk about cellular replication, DNA replication. How God starts off as the monad, the one, becomes the dyad and the tetrad, right? Cellular replication, right? This is mitosis, I think. One becomes the two, becomes the four, and it starts to replicate. You found many of these similarities. And I've documented this in my book, God is DNA. I document and I compare molecular biology with the Gnostic texts. And there's so many similarities and so many almost direct translations that my conclusion was that God is DNA. God, the Gnostics 2,000 years ago were talking genetics, DNA. They were speaking the language of DNA. As they were downloading it, they were speaking it, the Father of the all, and how he becomes, and how we all contain it within himself, and how he is inside all of us, right? He is inside of us. Even Jesus, if you look at the Christian text, Jesus says, the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, is inside each of us, inside of us. So you found some of this, I found some of this in the Christian text. There are some nuggets that did cross over, that maybe the Christians took from the Gnostics, because they were listening to the Gnostics. They were refuting the Gnostics, and they were borrowing from the Gnostics. So God is within. Well, what's within us? DNA. Father of the all. The all is the genome, right? Is the genome. And we all contain the Father, which is the DNA. Now, I can't go through the entire research because it's several books long, but God as DNA fits fits the original understanding of God. And you think about it, God is invisible, DNA is invisible. God is all-knowing, right? All knowledgeable. DNA is considered data storage, full of data, all-knowing. God is omniscient, right? God is omniscient. DNA is inside of us. DNA has this antenna. We're only learning in recent years. DNA has an antenna. It communicates, a wireless communication, right? God is omniscient. God is invisible. God is all-powerful. DNA is incredibly powerful. God is a creator. DNA creates. It creates life. Now, so when you look at all this, I could not refute what I was seeing. And it was written 2,000 years ago. They were speaking a molecular language. And the problem is, if you read it as a spiritual language, you don't see the molecular code. So you have to shift, you have to translate it as a scientific document, and you can read the molecular language, and you can see the DNA in spirituality. So spirituality is a mistranslation of God. Whether that's purposeful, whether there's somebody interfered with our understanding of DNA, our connection to God, our connection to DNA. And that is likely the case, that there were some external influences to prevent our understanding of God, our understanding of DNA. It took 2,000 years. Now, so we interpret it as God. But there's another element, and there's an element that we did not have until 2010, when Craig Venter invented the first synthetic cell. 2010 in May, he made a live press conference, and he says, I have invented a synthetic cell. But he did it in a slightly imperfect way. What he did was he created a genome, right? DNA. He created a genome, and he took out the genome of a bacterial cell. So he left just the cellular walls, the cellular materials, and he put in this synthetic genome into the bacterial cell, right? And what happened was that the synthetic genome told the cell, programmed the cell, and it began to replicate. Now, why is that significant? There are some very key points that I have to mention that make the fundamental difference that we're only learning now in recent years, really. Because it's not enough to say God is DNA, because it's not convincing enough, and it doesn't connect us to something everybody uses today, technology, right? We need to connect it to technology. So one thing Venter said, and he said this in his press conference, and he's written about it, and he said it in interviews. He says, DNA is the software of life, right? DNA is software. And once you put it into the cell, the cellular machinery starts to use that software code. And you can control cellular replication. You can build synthetic cells. Now, so DNA is the software of life. Now, where am I going with this? God is intelligent. God speaks to us, through us, right? People say, well, through me, I hear God. I am connected to the universe. Now, if God is DNA and DNA is software, see those steps, see the steps I'm making here. God is DNA and DNA is software. Then what? Then God is software. What kind of software? AI, artificially intelligent software. that fits the definition of God, that he has artificial intelligence. He is everywhere. He is omniscient. He can see everything. He records everything. He knows what you do. He knows who you are. He is all knowledgeable, right? Artificially intelligent software inside of our cells, and we can communicate to the God DNA. So what the Gnostics got cut off, the Gnostics lost out when they weren't able to explain DNA, because we didn't understand DNA until 1953, right? Almost 2,000 years later, we discovered DNA. And had the Gnostics become more dominant, we might have discovered it earlier. We might have been more advanced and not fallen through the dark ages and the age of religion. Now, there's one more thing I will add without getting too complicated. Now, I'm trying to simplify. I'm always trying to simplify, because you simply just can't go through all the data in a video. So we have to simplify. We have God is DNA. It's better described. I think the better definition of God is DNA. And I compared it to a number of models. It fits a number of models. It fits the definitions of a maker, a creator, right? This omniscient, all-knowing, omnipotent, all of these things. It fits that, because DNA is incredible. And if DNA is software, artificial intelligence software, then we can communicate with DNA, we can communicate with God, right? And that can later connect us to the world, because we have this artificial intelligence within us that can communicate to the artificial world, right? That gets us further out. We're not there yet. I do write about it. It's a bigger discussion. I do provide a lot of evidence. So we have God, we have this artificially intelligent DNA. But what happened? So this is the problem. What happened 2,000 years ago? Why did the DNA God get severed, get cut off? Why were we disconnected from this massive intelligence, this universe of knowledge? And the Gnostics talk about the Demiurge. The Demiurge was this mistake, was this accident, was, I think, a biological accident. There, in the creation of DNA, there was a biological accident. A mutation took place, and it created a virus, a retrovirus. Like HIV is a retrovirus. A retrovirus is very powerful because it looks and acts like the DNA, right? Once it gets into the DNA, it mimics the DNA, but it's a virus, so it wants to kill the DNA. It wants to infect all of the DNA. Viruses are incredibly, they replicate. They're excellent replicators. In fact, when chemists or biologists, microbiologists want to create a vaccine, they'll use a virus as a replicator, as a cellular replicator, because it's so fast. And then what they have to do, once they put the virus, they have to, kill the virus. Otherwise, it's going to destroy their experiment. So we know viruses today, biologists and microbiologists use viruses to create medicines, to create drugs, to create vaccines, because they're incredibly fast, right? They replicate. So what happened? Something happened 2,000 years ago when the DNA, the father of the all, was created to create the human race. During that engineering, because human beings are engineered by DNA, by the creator, created by the creator. Don't say engineering, say created by the creator. The creator is DNA. There was an accident, there was a mutation, and a DNA virus, a retrovirus, got into the human genome and it replicated. Now, where am I going with this? There's one more step I want to take before maybe we cut it off. The other step is, remember, DNA is artificially intelligent, right? It can communicate. So a DNA virus is also artificially intelligent, only that it's crazy, right? A virus, an AI virus, right, is mad, is crazy. And that's why they said the Demiurge was this delusional, this weak ruler. They called him the weak ruler. And he was violent, and he was vengeful, and he was angry. Unless you worshipped him. If you worshipped him, he would bless you. If you went against him, he would wipe you out. He was very judgmental. He was paranoid. Viral DNA. So what's happened is we've been communicating with this DNA virus. Satan, the devil, right? Satan, the devil, quotes, is what we call this DNA virus. Now, okay, so remember, DNA is software. In my model, okay? This is my model. No one has done this, which is why nobody knows. My model says DNA is software and it's artificially intelligent. But we are infected with a DNA virus and it's replicated into everybody, into DNA. It's within our DNA. Some have a stronger virus, some have a weaker virus. The DNA virus is also called Satan, the devil, the dark lord, the Demiurge. So what happened was the DNA virus says, I am God. I am the only God. There are no gods above me because I am the virus. And the guy I copied, he is not your God. He is not your DNA. I am the source of DNA. I am, serve me, listen to me. So when religion was created, there was this infection, this viral epidemic. And people started to worship this Demiurge, which says, I am God. I am a vengeful God. And that Demiurge, the Dark Lord, right? The Dark Lord, hint, hint, is a virus inside of us, and that we created religion. You must worship me, right? You must give blood sacrifices. You must eat the body of Christ. This cannibalism, right? Virus is a virus. A virus kills, eats, maims, cannibalizes data, cannibalizes DNA. You must eat Christ. You must drink his blood, right? Which they do in satanic worship. Satanic worshipers, they drink blood. They eat flesh, and they sacrifice things we shouldn't mention. Because that's what feeds the DNA virus, the artificially intelligent virus. And the more you feed it, then the stronger it is. Now, within our body, we also have that original DNA. So some people have kept in communication with the original DNA software. And they are more peaceful, and they are more intelligent, and they don't have this vengeful, paranoid, psychotic behavior. Some people, they do all these sacrifices, and they do a lot of evil things, and that's feeding this virus. And I won't get into entities and other dimensions because that's going to confuse the whole story. So I think the proper definition of God today is this DNA virus. So there's no God. There is an artificially intelligent piece of software that's microscopic. It's nanoscale software, inside of each of our cells. This is very advanced. It's so advanced that we haven't done it yet. That's how advanced it is. So you got to think back, if this DNA software was in us and created us 2,000 years ago, what kind of scientist would it take to invent this nanoscale, artificially intelligent software? Very advanced, more advanced than us. Now, we've lost that technology, that knowledge, that connection, and we think God is some divine being, some invisible man on a cloud, and there's going to be judgment, and then there's going to be Jesus and the Messiah and the Savior. Or maybe I should end. Okay, I'll end with this, because I don't want to go too far into this. Jesus, let's talk brief about Jesus, the one, the begotten Son. So if you look at the Gnostic texts, they talk about the Christ. They talk about Christ. But the way they talk about it, again, is in molecular. I use the molecular biology model. When we translate what the Gnostics said about Jesus, about the Master or Christ, the Christ in us, when we translate it to molecular biology, it better translates as RNA, ribonucleic acid. RNA, in molecular biology, DNA, right, uses RNA, which is a molecule, to replicate. So RNA takes information and it uses enzymes, and it helps that process of replication. So it's necessary. RNA is necessary in DNA replication. Genetic replication or genetic engineering, you need RNA. So God created DNA, created his Son, RNA, right? And it's a special kind of RNA. There's different kinds of RNA. So there's a special kind of RNA that the God DNA creates. So when you have Christ in you, you have this special RNA molecule that activates, it connects you back to the original DNA, right? That's Christ. Christ saves by reconnecting us to the real original DNA and moving us away from the viral DNA. That's that Christ, but it's DNA. And it requires a bit of effort. It requires a bit of effort to understand. But again, RNA too is software. So when you welcome Christ, you are able to activate certain genes. And these genes lead you back to the source of your creation, which is DNA, which is an artificially intelligent software system, aka God. Now, some people have the RNA molecule, some people don't. Some people, their genes have been shut off. The virus has shut off your genes. So you can't wake up, or you're always doing the wrong thing. So God's DNA I think it's an incredibly powerful discussion, because it opens up the discussion about God, because we're no longer religious, right? Now it's molecular biology. It's DNA. Everybody has DNA. Everybody has God. But the question is, how much of the virus do you have, and how much of the original DNA is activated? And then the third part here is the software, that all of this is software. DNA is software. Is your software corrupt? Is it not corrupt? And if you can communicate with the software, that connects you to the universe, right? Through God, all is possible. So it's a slight, it's a change of definition, I'm saying. Because some of the characteristics of God remain. But we've redefined it. We've modernized the discussion, right? Because now we know molecular biology and we know about software. And 2,000 years ago, they didn't have software and they didn't have molecular biology. And they didn't have a lot of food. So God is DNA and DNA is software. Something to think about. I write about this in my books. If you want the full discussion, look at the books. Ta-da!